Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Macroeconomics. Just to remind you of where we are developing our understanding of how macroeconomists tend to think about the business cycle, and we're doing so by developing the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We spent a lot of time talking about aggregate supply. Now we're working our way through our discussion of aggregate demand. And the way we're doing that is by breaking aggregate demand into parts: consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports, also known, of course, as net exports. So we've worked our way through each of these. We talked extensively about consumption. We talked extensively about investment. And on Monday, we talked about government spending. So to wrap up our discussion, we need to now turn our attention to discussing net exports. So that's our task for the day. Now, the key thing about net exports is that while consumption, investment, and government spending all had to do with, or almost entirely had to do with understanding conditions within the economy that we have in mind here, we're thinking about exports and imports. Suddenly, now stuff that's happening outside this economy can matter. Because exports, of course, are goods made here that were sold abroad, which means that it depends on, the amount of exports is going to depend on conditions outside. And that means that international factors may be among those that shift the aggregate demand curve. So, again, as with all the other elements, we'll be trying to achieve two goals. One will be the goal of understanding what does this net exports thing tell us about the shape of the aggregate demand curve? In other words, how does it depend on the price level? And then second, we'll be seeing if there are any additional factors that come into play with net exports that might shift the aggregate demand curve. So, and the interesting thing about net exports is that while consumption, investment, and government spending had in mind the opportunity cost of various things, let's see, if I'm going to invest in something, it means I'm not saving it directly, or it means I have to borrow, and so on. In the case of exports and imports, the opportunity cost of, let's say, buying something made abroad is what? Buying the same thing made here. So that's leading us to the question, why would you buy a good from abroad? As opposed to a similar version of the thing available here. So, why would you buy something from abroad? Yeah? Maybe it's cheaper. And, of course, thinking about something being cheaper than something else, which is a question about price, clearly is going to be very important for us because the whole question, at least the first question we have to answer is, how is the price level related to exports? So, yeah. Maybe it's cheaper. And if so, well, why not buy the foreign version? So to think about this, let's go with an example of a good that's available here, but for which a foreign-produced, very similar counterpart exists. So I think I've used examples from the car industry before, so why don't we just stick with that? Let's imagine a pretty simple standard US car, let's say the Ford Fiesta. And it is available for, let's say, $10,000. It's not the fanciest of cars, but it'll get you where you need to go. And now let's think of a foreign-produced counterpart. How about the Honda CR-V, made in Japan? And that costs $1 million. We have a problem. The Ford Fiesta costs $10,000. The Honda CR-V costs 1 million yen. I can't tell which one's cheaper. I need one more piece of information, right? I need to know what's the exchange rate between the currency used here and the currency used wherever the potential import is coming from. And in fact, there are three possibilities here. Suppose that it turns out that in the international currency exchange markets, $1 equals exactly 100 yen. Where are the goods more expensive if that's the exchange rate? Nowhere. They're exactly the same. Right? If you take $10,000 and you convert them to yen, you get 10,000 times 100, which is 1 million, which is exactly this. So in that case, they're the same. There's a second possibility, which is what if $100 is more than 100 yen? Well, if the dollar gives you more than 100 yen, then these $10,000 are more than 1 million yen, which means this car is expensive. So in this case, you have the US good is expensive. And then you have the third possibility, which is the US dollar is less than 100 yen. And of course, that's the opposite. In that case, $10,000 is less than 1 million yen, which means the US good is comparatively cheap. So in this case, you wouldn't expect to see anything. In this case, if the US good is expensive, you would expect to see a lot of imports of Japanese cars, right? Because they're cheaper. And in this case, the US good is cheap. You would expect not to be seeing imports of the Japanese cars. And in fact, what would Japanese consumers want? Again, US goods are cheap, so they probably would also buy less of their own cars, and in fact, that would then lead to an increase in exports. So we have these three possibilities. What happens depends on which situation we're in. Now, if you thought about the trade flows that I just described based on each of these situations, you might have thought, wait a second, the trade flows Professor Samaniego is describing are such that if we are on either of these situations, there are forces at play that might actually be pushing us towards the first case where everything is valued more or less the same. How so? Well, suppose we're in situation 2, so the US goods are expensive. Then, what would you observe? You would expect to observe a lot of people buying the Japanese alternative because it's cheaper, regardless of where they are in the world. But if you want to buy a Japanese good and you don't live in Japan, what do you first have to do? First have to buy the Japanese currency. So in this situation, US goods are expensive. The Japanese version is cheaper, so you want to buy it, but in order to buy it, first you have to buy Japanese currency, which does what to the value of the Japanese currency? Should go up. And if the value of the Japanese currency goes up, well then a dollar isn't worth more than 100 yen anymore. It's pushing you towards this situation. And here it's the exact same argument in reverse. Right? If here the US goods are cheap, then people will want to buy the US currency to get the US goods that are cheaper, which bids up the value of the US currency. So then the US is no longer worth less than 100. It's pushing towards this sort of balance. So we have a name for that intuition, and I'm going to give you that name, and then we're going to discuss it a bit more. This idea that exchange rates might be determined by equilibrating the value of different goods in various places is called Purchasing Power Parity, or PPP among friends. And you might think, well, Professor Samaniego, I understand the logic, I understand the intuition that exchange rates should adjust so that goods are roughly the same price everywhere. But I can't imagine that the entire exchange rate market for dollars and yen is determined by mismatches in the price of a particular good. And I would say, I agree with you. But what if there is some sort of mismatch in prices over all goods or many goods? Then you might expect something like this, or you might find it more reasonable for a mechanism like the one I described to start pushing around exchange rates so that big mismatches in prices are eliminated by the exchange rate change, because, again, where the goods are really expensive, people stop buying those goods, which means they stop buying that currency, so it loses value, and things balance out again. So what do we call it when the price of goods in a particular place goes up by a lot compared to what it was before or compared to somewhere else? It's inflation, exactly. So what we're really saying is that if I experience more inflation than you, then my currency should lose value. Obviously, compared to yours. Right? There's always got to be a trade partner. There always has to be someone else with a different currency. So again, this intuition, I hope, is clear that if there's a big mismatch in the value of goods, then the exchange rate should change so as to bring them back together. Where might we expect such overarching mismatches to occur? Well, it's if there are big differences in inflation among the two economies in question. Any questions, comments, or thoughts about the idea of PPP, purchasing power parity? No, not yet. Okay, so remember, our first question was, what is the relationship between the price level and exports and imports? If PPP is true, what happens? Well, there is a change in the price level. Let's say the price level goes up. What happens immediately? According to PPP, the currency loses value. In other words, when the price level changes, how should that affect exports and imports? Well, it shouldn't, because PPP is saying if my price level rises, it's immediately offset by a decline in the cost in the exchange rate, which means that for you abroad, the price of my goods actually hasn't changed once you take the exchange rate into account. So then if PPP is true, these things don't have any implications for the shape of the aggregate demand curve. They're not affected by the price level. So what do we need to do? Well, we're economists. We develop theories, but of course, we want these theories to be useful for understanding the world. So what we need to do next is look at the data and see, do the data support this idea of purchasing power parity, that the price differences in inflation ultimately drive exchange rates. So we're going to look at some data now. And before we do that, I want to write down on the board what it is that purchasing power parity is actually predicting. Suppose we drew two axes. On this axis, we wrote, let's say, inflation. In some units. And on this axis, we wrote loss of currency value in the same units, let's say percent. And let's say we take a particular place over a particular period of time. Let's say I'm trying to think of the ones that are on the figure. Let's say Peru in 1988. And we see that Peru in 1988 has inflation of, let's say, 8,000%. Then this theory says that the loss of value of the currency of Peru should be 8,000%, right? That's what it's saying if we take it at face value. If you take a particular place in a particular year and they experience inflation of, I don't know, 15%, then this theory says they should also experience a loss of value of their currency relative to some benchmark of 15%. And the same for any other place over a particular period of time, right? This value should equal this value. What am I actually plotting out here? This is a 45-degree line, right? The line where the x value equals the y value. So this is what purchasing power parity is predicting, and so this is what we're going to check in the data. As soon as I can figure out how to get the screen to come down. So here it is. Again, this axis is the inflation. The y-axis is the loss of value of the currency of the relevant place. And here each dot represents a country over a particular period of time. And what do you see? Is this a 45-degree line? Pretty close. What else do you see? Anything unusual or notable about these places or about these numbers or about the title? The title of this figure is PPP in Great Hyperinflations of the 20th Century. And if you look at the numbers on the axes, these are some pretty crazy numbers. These are really big. we can conclude from this that, well, in extreme cases, PPP works. But these are extreme cases. Yeah. There's Peru in 1988 to 1990. Around the time I left. Not a coincidence. Anyway, so why don't we look at some less extreme cases? This is the same figure, but for a broader set of places, including places that didn't experience any great hyperinflation and the few that actually did. And it's averaging it over, 20 years, as I mentioned. And so, does this look like a 45-degree line? Weiss is shaking his head. If you look out off to the right, kinda, sorta, but when you get down here to the countries that don't have particularly high inflation, it looks like a blob, more on a line. Right? So that's suggesting that, again, PPP works over maybe over long periods of time, or maybe in extreme cases, but it doesn't seem to work that well when the inflation rates involved aren't very big. And so that suggests that maybe PPP doesn't work. If it doesn't, then it means the price of oil does have an impact on exports and imports. I have one more picture for you. It's not another version of this figure. Instead, what it is, actually, before we do that, why don't we zoom in on these countries? I said, I think they're more like a blob. Yeah, if you look at these guys, that's not a line. It's a cloud. Yeah?
So how could Japan have like 7% inflation, but yet their currency is still more valuable than they appreciate at all? In fact,
Relative to the United States, which is the benchmark here. Well, we'll figure it out. What must be going on if PPP doesn't seem to work? And then, of course, that raises multiple questions. Why doesn't PPP work? And second, if it doesn't work, it means that something else is determining exchange rates. What's that? So let's go with the first. Instead of showing you another version of this picture, what I want to do is I want to pick two of these countries in the blob, in the cloud. Let's say the United States and the United Kingdom. Those are the ones I picked. And as in addition to this comparison that I've showed you in these figures, there's another thing that PPP is predicting, which is that suppose between this year and next year, the UK experiences more inflation than the United States, then what should you expect to see? You should expect to see the UK currency lose value compared to the dollar that year. And if the following year the opposite happens, then it should gain value. In other words, we could construct a predicted exchange rate using only the differences in inflation between these two places and see what that looks like over time compared to the actual exchange rate. So that's what I want to show you now. Okay. So the thin line, which doesn't move around much, is the constructed predicted exchange rate that's based only on differences in inflation between the UK and the US, starting out in, 1973. And the other one, the thicker line, this is the actual exchange rate between the United States dollar and the pound sterling. And what do you see? First of all, they're not the same. That's very clear. In other words, PPP isn't working, but even though they aren't the same, they never really wander too far from each other, do they? Right, they start out the same in 1973, Then they're actually similar for a while, and then suddenly the exchange rate, the actual one, starts to drop, whereas based on inflation rates, you wouldn't have expected them to. So it wanders off until it's around 100, whereas the predicted one is around 150. These aren't the actual exchange rates, these are just index numbers, which makes it easy to see that they're off by about 50%. And then what happens? It starts coming back. And then it overshoots. And then what happens? It starts coming back. And then further out here, it doesn't overshoot, but it never really gets too far away, although it is some distance away from the predicted exchange rates. So what does that suggest? It suggests PPP maybe isn't telling us exactly what the exchange rate is, but you can never really deviate from it by too much, which means it's still useful. And too much here looks like it's something on the order of 50%. So I think the logic of purchasing power parity is clear, but why would it be that on a day-to-day basis, purchasing power parity isn't predicting exchange rates, but it's sort of putting some bounds on how far away our exchange rate can wander off from the predictions of purchasing power parity? Why might it be that it only bites, it only applies either in extreme situations or when you've deviated significantly from it? What might there be interfering with the ability of PPP to work more frequently? Or alternatively, to put it another way, what about our story that justified PPP as a theory might be wrong or might be missing? So suppose you lived here and you were thinking about buying a Ford Fiesta. Would it really be true that you could just compare the cost of the Honda CR-V in Japan, and if it's slightly cheaper, just send an order for it and it will arrive and you'll just spend? What's missing there? I can see some people mouthing some things and shaking their heads, but what's missing? You have to get it here. You have to ship it over. And the cost of getting that thing from wherever it was made might be quite significant. And to the extent that those transportation costs exist, that's going to interfere with the intuition behind PPP. You're only going to see big changes in trade behavior that, in our intuition, would then go and affect the exchange rate if the difference in value was so big that it's overcoming the transport cost as well as any differences in value of the goods themselves. So for example, many years ago, I bought a car and I was sitting in the dealer having already decided I wanted one of their cars. And it was a guy, he was looking through his inventory on the computer and he said, oh, this car here with these particular features, sunroof, heated seats, I forget what else. This particular car that just arrived in Baltimore, in the port. And I will give you this car at a discount. I'm not going to charge you the cost of bringing the car from the port to the dealer if you buy that one. Because then first it was a short sale and he didn't have to then take the car and do whatever they do to mothball them and put them into the warehouse. He could just have it right there, then I would come along and pick it up and drive it away. And they would save a lot of hassle. Right? So how much was the savings from buying the car and not having to pay for it to be transported from the port in Baltimore to the dealer in Bethesda? $2,000. Okay. That's a lot. And that's just the cost of bringing the car, getting the car, I guess, off the ship onto a truck and driving it to Bethesda. I assume plus insurance, things like that. So that's how big the transportation costs can be. And that's just bringing it from the port in Baltimore. That's not including the cost of shipping the thing across the ocean from Germany. It's not including the cost of transporting it from the factory in Germany to the port, right? So the transportation costs can be really big. And actually there was an economist, I think it's Sergio Rebelo, who, along with some teammates, tried to estimate, well, how big are these transportation costs in general, compared to the value of the transported goods. And this was a few years ago, so this may no longer be true, but the answer he came up with was around 50%. That it adds a 50% extra, which is eerily consistent with the UK-US exchange rate deviations, right? They never go beyond 50% and then they start coming back again. But within those bounds, they can do anything. So what does that tell us? Just to bring this all home, we're asking what's the impact of the price level on exports and imports. We were saying that if purchasing power parity holds all the time, then the then the price level has no impact on net exports because the exchange rate offsets any price differences. But we just saw that it doesn't. PPP takes a while to hold. It requires big deviations to do anything. And so that suggests that higher prices actually might have the impact of, well, now if the price level goes up, my goods are more expensive than yours, and so I would expect you to buy fewer of mine, and then since your goods are relatively cheap, that suggests my imports might go up, which means that when the price level rises, net exports go down. So what is this saying? This is saying that to the extent that exports and imports respond to the price level, they're contributing to the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. Okay? Any questions or comments or thoughts? So we have two more things that we need to do here. One is, now we know what this says about the shape of the demand curve. What does it tell us about other factors that might move it around? And the other loose end that we have is, okay, fine, PPP only works over long periods of time or in extreme cases. But we know exchange rates move around all over the place. We just saw the exchange rate for the pound sterling goes up and down, varies month to month, week to week, day to day. Within a single day, the exchange rate is moving around. So the question is, what must be behind exchange rate determination at shorter time frames than, I don't know, 5 years or whatever, however long it takes for PPP to set in? Well, exchange rates are determined in markets where some people have one currency but they want another. And so the question is, why do people have one currency and want another? One answer for that was because they're trying to get goods from that place. That's how we came up with PPP. But what else might you be interested in buying from another place that uses a different currency, other than goods or services? How about shares? How about bonds? Or maybe you want to buy a company. I guess that's kind of like buying shares. So that's actually what's going on. The majority of the, let's say, dollars exchanged for yen and yen exchanged for dollars aren't there because someone wants to import goods from somewhere else. They're actually there because someone wants to invest in the economy or save, however you want to think about it, or gamble in the assets from another country. So let's say it's US banks buying shares in the Japanese stock exchange or buying Japanese government bonds. That kind of stuff is what's mainly going on here. And so then what's determining the exchange rate is any movements that those investors have that suggest that, okay, actually, now I just invested in Japanese government bonds, but now some new information came, maybe I should put them in some different asset. And then that, in turn, of course, affects the value of the currency, not just the value of the assets. And so that's what's going on. And so if you were to take, well, if you are interested in that topic of exchange rate determination and how do international currency markets work, it's a bit beyond the scope of this course, but you could, if you're interested in it, you could see that in more detail in Financial Economics 2121, which I sometimes teach. And there's also a class called International Economics 2180, where maybe a third to half of the class is about this. And then there's a class called 2182, International Finance, which is entirely about this topic. But in a nutshell, the idea is going to be something like, here we had thought about how the prices of goods in different countries might, how differences in those prices might lead to exchange rate movements. And ultimately, what do the exchange rate movements do? They equalize, they move so as to equalize more or less the costs of goods in different places. What you'll learn in either of those classes about exchange rates is that there's something similar going on to purchasing power parity, but it doesn't have to do with the cost of different goods. Rather, it has to do with the expected profit from investing in different assets. So let's say if I invest in the US, and suppose I invest in buying United States government bonds, then I get some interest rate, let's say 4%. The theory is going to be my alternative, or one of my alternatives, is to invest in, let's say, Japanese government bonds. And then if I do that, I actually get two things. One is, of course, I get whatever interest the Japanese government bond pays. But the other is that in order to take that position, I have to actually take several additional steps. First, I have to buy Japanese currency. Only then can I buy the Japanese government bond. I hold it for the year. It pays me back with interest. But for me to be able to spend that, I have to then take that and convert it back into dollars. And so now there are actually two possible sources of return from doing that. One is going to be, well, how much interest is the Japanese government paying? And the second is, what happened to the value of the currency over that year? If it gained value, that's an additional plus for me. If it lost value, that's a minus. And so the theory is going to be that the returns on those two positions, investing in the US government bond and investing in the Japanese government bond, plus any gain from the currency changing over time, those two things have to be equal. So that's sort of better theory of exchange rate determination, better in the sense that it works over shorter time frames. There's a similar theory that has to do not with government bonds, but to do with, again, things like shares. That again, you invest in the shares of the US, but alternatively you could invest in the shares in Japan. Your returns from doing that depend also not just on what's happening or what you expect to happen in the stock market there. It depends on also what happens or what you think is going to happen to the value of the currency over that period. Okay? Any questions, comments, thoughts? So PPP doesn't work, or at least not over short periods of time, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful. And it also doesn't mean that we don't know, or we don't have better ideas of what's driving exchange rates. Great. So here is what we have learned about the shape of the aggregate demand curve. Next, we want to figure out what other factors might affect the aggregate demand curve, might shift it around. And of course, the answer would be anything that affects exports and imports other than the price level. So what factors could we think of that might affect the price level? Sorry, that might affect exports and imports. There's one kind of obvious one, I guess, because remember, we're saying the whole reason why the price level might affect exports and imports is because purchasing power parity doesn't hold. Bit of a mouthful. And which means when the price level rises, the exchange rate does not respond, at least not immediately. So that means that when the price level rises, we're holding the exchange rate constant. And if we're holding anything constant, it means that if and when that thing itself changes, it's probably going to shift exports and or imports. In other words, suppose the exchange rate changes. And again, we know exchange rates change for reasons other than the price level. If, let's say, imagine we're here and suddenly the US dollar gains value, then we would be in a situation like this where US goods are expensive, and you might expect, well, that means people abroad won't want to buy US goods, so US exports would go down. Similarly, people here suddenly see, well, the foreign goods are cheaper, so maybe I want to import more of them. Anything else? Well, the amount of exports naturally depends on the ability or willingness of people abroad to buy goods made here. So what if that ability or willingness changes? So what I have in mind here is a phrase that you might see every now and then in the news, depending on what's going on, which is a phrase along the lines of, when the United States gets a fever, Mexico catches a cold. Have you heard some variation of that? What's going on? Suppose this is the aggregate demand of Mexico. The United States is an important trading partner of Mexico. There's a lot of goods going back and forth. And suppose the United States goes into a recession for some reason. Maybe there was a financial crisis, or who knows, doesn't really matter what's the deep cause. The point is the United States goes into recession. Well, if the United States goes into recession, United States citizens or residents have less income. And if they have less income, they're of course buying less of everything, including both goods made there and goods made abroad. In other words, if the United States goes into recession, suddenly Mexican exports to the United States decline because the trading partner is just buying less of everything because they're in a recession. So, in other words, one factor, an additional factor determining how much exports you have is income abroad. In other words, you could, so the idea here is that if one of your big trading partners experiences a recession, that's going to decrease your aggregate demand as well, even if otherwise everything was going fine. Just because your trade partner's demand for exports, for your exports, has gone down. And of course the opposite could happen, right? What if your trade partner is doing extremely well economically? That's going to spill over to you because they'll demand more of your exports and will increase aggregate demand. Okay, any questions, comments, or thoughts? So, I guess that means we are done. Done in the sense that we've discussed all of the elements of aggregate demand. So now would be a good time to put all of this together in one place. So let me just clean the board. So over a couple of weeks, we've managed to have a thorough discussion of the various things that determine aggregate demand. We have here on this axis the price level, and on this axis real GDP. And we've concluded that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and it's downward sloping for two reasons. One reason was because when the price level rises, it erodes the real value of your savings. Now we have a second reason here, which is that when the price level rises, it makes your goods relatively expensive compared to potential imports, which increases imports and lowers exports. In addition, we now have a long list of things that might shift the demand curve that we can construct by reminding ourselves of the different factors that affect consumption, investment, and so on. So starting with consumption, the first thing we discuss with consumption is that it's limited by disposable income, and so the things that affect disposable income are going to matter. Disposable income is income minus taxes plus transfers, so changes in taxes and transfers should affect the position of the demand curve. Right. More transfers or fewer taxes drive it to the left. More taxes or fewer transfers drive it to the, sorry, this is the right. Lower taxes or higher transfers push it out to the right. Higher taxes or fewer transfers lower this to the left. Then we noted that you can also spend out of your savings and wealth, and so significant changes in your savings and wealth might also affect the position of the demand curve. Let's say the stock market rises significantly, so that means people who own shares have more wealth, so demand shifts to the right, something like that. And you can also borrow, and that means that interest rates matter. And since you're borrowing against your expected future income, then those forecasts of your future income could matter as well. This, of course, raises a specter of animal spirits. You may remember that animal spirits is a name for the idea that since your expected future income determines your behavior now, if you expect the future to be dim, then you won't invest or consume as much because you have to save for the bad times ahead, and of course if everyone does this, then demand shifts backwards, demand decreases, and well, you create the negative situation that you were afraid of just by being afraid of it. So these self-fulfilling panics or this self-fulfilling exuberance we refer to as animal spirits, and again, not everyone thinks they're a thing, but some economists do. What else do we have? We also had that financial stability could be important because, again, if the financial system isn't functioning properly, you may not be able to borrow easily against your future income, or you may not be able to access your savings. Then what else do we have? When we talked about investment, we noted that investment is determined in the market for loanable funds. And that added the idea that therefore investment depends on the behavior not just of investors and their prospects, but of the people that are supplying the funds to them, the savers. And that came up in two contexts. One was it means that that's another way in which conditions abroad, I guess you could call this willingness to save, conditions abroad could spill over into a country. Here was one, but through net exports and imports, but in addition, thinking about the loanable funds market provides another because some of the savings might come from abroad. And if those foreign savers suddenly decide to pull back, that's going to affect investment here. Then there was also government spending, and that was another place where the loanable funds market came up because we used it to say, well, anytime you increase government spending, something else on the budget has to change, and there could be crowding out. And now today, we have a few more items to add to this list. We just saw that the exchange rate could matter. And we saw that income abroad could matter. Right. So you may be thinking, Professor Samaniego, are you expecting us to memorize this list? How is this going to show up on my next midterm exam? Will we be expected to regurgitate this list from scratch? The answer is no. But remember, each of these things comes out of thinking about the elements of aggregate demand. And yes, of course, you do need to remember that. It all comes out of thinking about their determinants systematically. So in that sense, they're sort of common sense. What I might do, however, is what you might expect to see on your midterm is something like, let's say there is a decrease in financial stability. How do you expect this to affect the position of the aggregate demand curve? And again, you should be able to answer that, right? Well, financial instability is obviously a bad thing. You can't access your savings, or you can't borrow against your future income, so you'd expect aggregate demand to decrease. How will we be using it? Well, next week, because I don't think we have enough time for that now, but next week what we're going to do is we're going to take everything we learned about aggregate demand and combine it with everything we learned about aggregate supply. And as you might guess, we're going to argue that the price level and real GDP are jointly determined by the interaction of demand and supply. All right, that's the first thing we'll do. Second, remember this whole discussion is motivated by us trying to understand the business cycle. So, where is the business cycle coming from? Well, to state the obvious, this is quite a long list, right? There are all sorts of things that might move aggregate demand. And if any of them changes, well, you'll have aggregate demand moving around, one way or the other. So, that's going to be the way in which macroeconomists tend to think about how the business cycle works. It's precisely that the aggregate demand curve may move significantly if any of these things move significantly. And we macroeconomists usually refer to a large, particularly unexpected change in any of these things as a shock. So the economy is going to be subject all the time to various shocks to each of these things. And a shock to any of those things is going to shift the demand curve and is going to end up affecting both the price level and real GDP. In response to a shock, well, there will be two things that we want to do. One is, if the economy experiences a shock, what happens next, so to speak? Like, how does the impact of a particular shock evolve in the short run and the long run? Because remember, we had both short run and long run GDP there, supply there. We'll have to figure out what happens in the short run, what happens in the long run. And second, remember that some of these items, interest rates, taxes and transfers, and government spending, are under the control of, in some cases, the government, in some cases, the Fed. So the other thing we're going to discuss is, well, given that this demand curve is being buffeted around by various shocks, but given that some of these items are under the control of the government or the Fed, is there something they can or should do to deal with those shocks? Okay? So that's the game plan pretty much for the rest of the semester. Any questions, comments, or thoughts about that? Well, in that case, I think we have time for one of our usual exit quizzes. Question 1. Net exports equals what? Exports minus imports, exports plus imports, imports minus exports, or imports plus exports? At least two of those are the same. Exports minus imports. Very good. Important to get that one right. True or false? If my currency gains value, my exports decrease. Sorry, my exports increase. Sorry, I misread that. It's false. If my currency gains value, my goods become more expensive and people don't want them anymore. True or false? If my inflation rate is higher than yours, then your currency should gain value. Relative to mine, of course. And of course, this one is true. That's what purchasing power parity tells us should happen eventually. Type your answer. What do we call this effect from the previous question? The answer should be 3 letters. The answer is PPP. 3 letters. Next, why does PPP often take so long to work? Of course, the answer is transportation costs. And last of all, if US growth slows, then in Canada, what would you expect? The answer is the first one. Growth slows because aggregate demand in Canada decreases. All right, let's see how we did. Third is Thomas. Second is Ian. And the winner is Macy. All right, good job, everyone. Macy, if you want to come up, I have a little something for you. Everyone else, nice to see you. Look forward to seeing you next week, if not before. Take care.